The morning Elias Caldwell's two sons climbed onto the fence rail of the main corral and declared, in complete unison, that their father needed a wife. The rancher nearly choked on his coffee. He stood there in the early gold of a Texas sunrise, the year 1878 pressing its heat down on the flat-topped hills of the hill country like a warm hand on a fevered brow, and stared at his boys as though they had just announced they planned to rope the moon. Tobias was 12, dark-haired and serious in the way of boys who have seen too much too soon. Samuel was 9, gap-toothed and freckled, possessed of a grin that could disarm a rattlesnake. They sat side by side on that top rail like a pair of crows, their boots dangling, their eyes fixed on their father with identical expressions of absolute certainty. "We talked about it," Tobias said. "We took a vote." "A vote," Elias repeated. 2-0, Samuel added cheerfully. "You lost." Elias looked at the coffee in his hand. He looked at the 2,000 acres of rolling Texas hill country that his wife Margaret had loved with every breath in her body. He looked at the empty porch of the ranch house, where her rocking chair still sat with a faded quilt folded over its arm, 4 years after the fever had taken her. "Boys," he said carefully, "a man does not just go out and find a wife like he goes out and finds a stray calf." "Why not?" Samuel asked. Elias had no immediate answer for that which he suspected his sons had counted on. It was not as though the idea had never crossed his mind. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered and sun-browned, with calloused hands and laugh lines that had grown deeper since they had stopped being used for laughing. The Caldwell Ranch ran 500 head of cattle and required a small army of hired hands to keep it operating. He had money enough, land enough, a good name in Kerrville and the surrounding county. But there was a particular kind of loneliness that money and land could not address, and on the cold evenings when the wind came down from the north, and the boys were asleep, and the house was very quiet, Elias knew exactly what that loneliness felt like. Still, knowing a thing and doing something about it were two entirely different affairs. "We want a mother," Tobias said, and his voice had gone quiet and careful in that way it did when he was trying very hard not to show that something mattered deeply to him. "Not to replace Mama, we know that is not possible, but someone to be here." Elias set his coffee cup down on the top post of the fence. He looked at his older boy, who was so much like Margaret in the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his gray eyes, and he felt the old grief move through him like a slow river. "Someone to be here," he said softly. "Yes, sir," Tobias said. "Someone to make it feel like a home again instead of just a place we live." Samuel nodded vigorously, his gap-toothed grin replaced for once by something more earnest. "And someone who can make biscuits that do not taste like the bottom of a boot because Papa, yours truly do," Elias laughed. It surprised him, the laugh coming out of him sudden and genuine. He had not laughed like that in some time. "All right," he said, and then caught himself. "All right, we'll think about it." "You have been thinking about things for 4 years," Tobias said quietly. Elias looked at his son for a long moment. 12 years old and already wiser than most grown men the rancher knew. "Yes," Elias admitted, "I suppose I have." He picked up his coffee cup and walked back toward the house, and behind him he heard Samuel whisper to his brother, "I think that means yes," and Tobias whisper back, "It means yes." It did mean yes, even if Elias was not entirely ready to admit it to himself yet. The decision did not come all at once. It came the way most important decisions come to a man who has been alone a long time, gradually, and then suddenly, the way a dam holds and holds until one morning it simply does not hold anymore. 3 weeks after the boys' declaration on the fence rail, Elias rode into Kerrville to collect supplies and found himself standing in front of the Mercantile reading the community notice board, where Mrs. Gruber from the boarding house had pinned a notice about the Frontier Marriage Correspondence Service out of San Antonio. He did not copy down the address. He told himself he was not going to. He rode home and fed his horse and ate supper with his sons and lay in his wide, too quiet bed, and stared at the ceiling until past midnight. The next week he rode into Kerrville again, and this time he wrote down the address. The correspondence service was run by a formidable woman named Mrs. Dolores Whitmore, who communicated through a series of letters that managed to be simultaneously businesslike and warmly encouraging, which Elias suspected was a professional gift she had cultivated over many years of connecting lonely ranchers with hopeful women from the eastern states. She asked him to describe himself, his ranch, his sons, and his expectations. He wrote 3 drafts before arriving at one he did not immediately want to burn. He was honest in it. He said he was not looking for a woman to love as a transaction. He said his sons were the most important thing in his world. He said the ranch was his life and his livelihood, and whoever came into it would be coming into something that was already whole in its own way, but that there was room in it, genuine room, for someone who was willing to stay. He sealed the letter and mailed it, and then tried not to think about it for the next 6 weeks. Mrs. Whitmore sent back 3 profiles. 2 were women from Ohio who sounded perfectly pleasant and thoroughly unsuited to ranch life. The third was a woman named Clara Denton, 26 years old, from a small town in Virginia, who had been working as a schoolteacher and who wrote, in her accompanying letter, that she had always believed the frontier was where the real living happened, and that she was tired of waiting for her life to begin. Elias read that last line 3 times. He wrote back. She wrote back. The letters went back and forth through the fall of 1878 with increasing frequency, and Elias found himself, against his better judgment and all his considerable caution, looking forward to them. Clara wrote with intelligence and humor and a directness that reminded him, painfully and pleasantly, of Margaret. But she was her own person entirely, and through the letters she became vivid to him, a real woman with opinions about books and strong feelings about how cattle should be managed, and a dry wit that occasionally made him laugh aloud alone in his study, which he found faintly embarrassing. He told his sons about her in December, when the hill country had gone dry and gold, and the nights were sharp with cold. Tobias received the news with measured consideration, like a judge examining evidence. Samuel received it by immediately asking if she could make biscuits. "I do not know," Elias said. "You should ask," Samuel said. "That is important information." Elias did ask in his next letter, framing it as an inquiry about her cooking in general, because he could not bring himself to specify that his 9-year-old considered her biscuit-making capabilities a matter of paramount importance. Clara wrote back that she was a competent cook, not a brilliant one, but that she was willing to learn, and that if biscuits were a particular concern she would practice. He fell a little in love with her right there in the study, over that letter. Clara Denton arrived on the stage from San Antonio on a cold Tuesday morning in February of 1879, and Elias and his sons were standing on the wooden sidewalk outside the Kerrville stage station when the coach pulled in. Elias had spent an unreasonable amount of time wondering what she would look like. The correspondence service had not provided a portrait, and Clara had declined to describe herself in her letters, saying only that she would be the one who looked slightly overwhelmed and was trying very hard not to show it. He spotted her immediately. She stepped down from the coach with one hand on the driver's steadying arm and the other gripping a worn leather traveling bag, and she stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk in the thin February sunlight and looked around at Kerrville, Texas, with an expression that was precisely as she had described, slightly overwhelmed and trying very hard not to show it. She was of medium height, slender but not frail, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a practical hat that had seen better days. Her face was open and pretty in an unself-conscious way, with dark eyes that moved quickly and took in everything, the kind of eyes that belonged to a person who had spent years watching and learning the particular texture of the world around her. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool, sensible boots, and an expression that, even in its effort at composure, managed to convey both intelligence and an appealing determination to be equal to whatever came next. She saw Elias before he had fully decided what to do with himself. He had been standing there with his hat in his hands, which he realized with sudden self-consciousness was not a particularly impressive posture, but it was too late to correct it. Her expression shifted. A small smile appeared, careful and real. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, and her voice was clear and had a slight lilt that was entirely her own. "Miss Denton," he said, "welcome to Kerrville." He put his hat back on because he needed to do something with his hands. He was aware that he was probably staring. He was also aware that he was 34 years old and had faced down cattle stampedes and one very determined mountain lion without losing his composure, and was now finding it unexpectedly difficult to be composed in front of a woman of medium height with auburn hair and sensible boots. Samuel stepped forward before Elias could manage anything further. "Can you make biscuits?" he asked. Clara Denton looked down at the gap-toothed 9-year-old with absolute seriousness. "I can," she said, "and I have been practicing." Samuel turned to his brother with an expression of profound satisfaction. "She can make biscuits," he announced. Tobias, with the dignity of his 12 years, extended his hand to Clara. "I am Tobias Caldwell," he said. "I am sorry for my brother." "Do not be," Clara said, shaking his hand gravely. Biscuits are important. The tension in Elias's chest, which had been sitting there since approximately the moment she stepped off the coach, loosened by a degree that surprised him considerably. The arrangement, as they had agreed through their letters, was that Clara would stay at Mrs. Gruber's boarding house in Kerrville for a period of time that they both agreed would be however long it needed to be before they had determined whether marriage was something they genuinely wished to pursue. Elias would call on her there. She would visit the ranch. If at any point either of them felt the situation was wrong, they had both pledged complete honesty. It was, Elias had noted in one of his letters, a businesslike approach to a deeply personal matter. Clara had written back that she preferred to think of it as a sensible approach to a potentially wonderful thing. He had kept that letter. The calling went slowly at first, the way two careful people get to know each other when both of them have been shaped by difficulty and learned to be cautious. Elias drove out to Mrs. Gruber's on Thursday afternoons, and they sat in the parlor and talked, and then after a few weeks began taking walks through town. And then Clara began accompanying him to the ranch on Saturdays to help with whatever needed helping with. She was not what he had expected. He had expected competence because her letters had radiated it. He had expected intelligence, ditto. He had not fully expected the humor, the way it came out sideways and dry when she was comfortable, or the way she looked at the hill country landscape with a genuine wonder that she made no effort to conceal. She had grown up in the rolling green softness of Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, and the Texas hill country, with its limestone bluffs and cedar and live oak and open sky that went on, until you thought it must eventually run out but somehow never did, was a revelation to her. "It is the biggest sky I have ever seen," she said one Saturday afternoon when they were standing on the high pasture above the main house, looking west. The light was going amber and the air smelled of cedar and cold coming earth. "You get used to it," Elias said. "I hope I do not," she said. "Think I would like to always find it this extraordinary." He looked at her profile against that enormous sky. He did not say anything because there was nothing adequate to say. The boys, for their parts, conducted what amounted to their own separate assessment of Clara Denton, entirely independent of their fathers, and reported to him in regular installments like small correspondence. Samuel's reports were generally favorable and food-related. She had indeed made biscuits on her third visit to the ranch, and they had been notably better than Elias's, a fact Samuel announced to the entire table with the air of a man delivering a historical verdict. Tobias's assessment was more complex and took longer to arrive, but it came in stages, each one representing a small further opening. The stage that mattered most happened on a Thursday in early March, when Elias was out in the far pasture mending fence, and Clara was at the ranch house with the boys. She did not know that she was being observed. Tobias had found her in the garden that Margaret had kept and that had been largely untended for 4 years, and he had stood in the doorway watching her walk slowly through it, looking at the dormant rose bushes and the dry herb beds with an expression that was careful and respectful, as though she understood she was walking through something sacred. He told Elias about it that evening quietly after Samuel was in bed. "She did not try to fix it," Tobias said. "She just looked at it, and then she came inside and did not say anything about it." Elias said nothing. "I think," Tobias said, choosing his words with great care, "that she understands things without having to be told. That is not easy to do." Elias looked at his son, this serious, careful boy who was so much his mother's child, and felt something move through him that was tender and grateful and complicated all at once. "No," he agreed. "It is not easy to do." Clara came to the ranch the following Saturday and Elias found her in the garden again, but this time she had brought her own garden gloves and a small trowel, and she was gently turning the earth around the base of one of the rose bushes. She looked up when she heard him approach, and for a moment she looked uncertain, as though she were not sure she had the right to be there. "I asked Tobias," she said quickly. "Asked him if it would be all right. He said yes." Elias crouched down beside the rose bush. It was one Margaret had brought from her mother's house in the hill country, a climbing rose that had never quite climbed the way she had intended it to, but that came back every spring regardless, stubborn and determined. "She loved this garden," he said. "I know," Clara said softly. "Tobias told me about it." "Not everything, but enough." They knelt together in the dry Texas earth for a moment that stretched out comfortable and quiet between them. "It does not bother you," Elias asked, "that there was someone before, that this place is full of her?" Clara set down her trowel and looked at him directly, the way she had, that way of meeting a thing head-on without flinching. "It would bother me if you had forgotten her," she said. "A man who loved his wife and mourns her honestly is a man worth knowing. A man who pretends she never existed would be someone else entirely." Elias looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was full and clear, and the cedar smell was strong in the air, and somewhere across the pasture one of his ranch hands was whistling while he worked. "Clara," he said. "Yes." He did not say what he had been about to say. Instead, he picked up her trowel and handed it back to her and stood up and brushed the dirt from his knees. "You are going to need more than one trowel if you intend to tackle the whole garden." She smiled at that, slow and real. "I know where the tool shed is," she said. He had to walk away before she saw that he was smiling too, which she probably already knew anyway because he suspected Clara Denton missed very little. March gave way to April, and April in the Texas hill country is a thing of unreasonable beauty. The bluebonnets came up in sweeping blue drifts along every roadside and hillside, and the creek that ran through the south end of the Caldwell property ran high and clear with the winter runoff, and the air was warm in the afternoons in a way that promised summer without yet delivering it. The ranch was busy with spring work, calving and branding, and the endless maintenance of fence lines that seemed to damage themselves out of spite the moment a person's back was turned. Clara had taken a position teaching at the Kerrville schoolhouse, which gave her both income and purpose, while the situation between herself and Elias continued its careful, deliberate development. The children of the town, who had been somewhat feral under their previous teacher's distracted management, were rapidly reorganized under Clara's quiet, firm, intelligent hand. She was not a strict teacher in the traditional sense. She was a demanding one, which was different, demanding not silence and obedience but attention and thought. And the children, most of them, responded to being expected to think as children generally do when someone gives them the respect of the expectation. Tobias, who had been doing his lessons largely on his own with whatever books could be found, rode into Kerrville on Mondays and Wednesdays to attend her class. He was advanced beyond most of the other children his age, and Clara worked with him separately on increasingly complex texts and problems, which delighted him in a way that outdoor work never quite had, though he was capable and conscientious at the ranch tasks. Samuel was less interested in formal learning but deeply interested in Clara, whom he followed around the ranch on her Saturday visits with the determination of a small, freckled shadow. "He has adopted you," Elias observed one afternoon in April, watching his younger son trail Clara across the yard as she carried a basket of eggs from the henhouse. "I am honored," she said, without breaking stride, and Samuel beamed. The proposal, when it came on an April evening when the bluebonnets were at their peak, and the sky was doing that particular thing it does in Texas in the spring, going pink and gold, and then deep violet in stages that seemed almost theatrical in their extravagance, as though the landscape were aware of being beautiful and could not resist displaying it. Elias had driven Clara back to Mrs. Gruber's in the wagon, as he usually did on Saturday evenings, and they had sat for a while on the bench outside the boarding house, watching the sky do its theatrical thing. And Elias had been aware for most of the drive that he needed to say something, and could not quite assemble the words into a form that felt adequate. He was not, it must be said, a man who struggled with words ordinarily. He ran a large operation, negotiated cattle deals, managed hired hands, handled the practical business of ranch life with straightforward competence. But Clara Denton had managed, over the course of 2 months of careful Thursday parlor visits and Saturday ranch days and letters that had never entirely stopped, to matter to him in a way that made straightforward competence feel insufficient. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said, and her voice was quiet and attentive in the way it always was when she knew something important was coming. "I'm going to say something, and I want you to know that I mean it entirely and that I am aware it may be too soon, and if you need more time, we'll give you whatever time you need." She turned to look at him. The violet sky was behind her and the lamplight from Mrs. Gruber's front window was soft on her face. "You are going to ask me to marry you," she said. "I was building up to it." "You were circling it very thoroughly," she agreed, and the corner of her mouth moved. "Clara Denton," he said, and gave up on the building up entirely because he suspected she was right and he had been circling it long enough. "I would like to marry you. Not because I am lonely, though I am. Not because my sons need a mother, though they do. But because you are the most honest, clearest-eyed, genuinely remarkable person I have encountered in a great many years, and I would like very much for you to be my wife." The quiet that followed lasted long enough that he felt the first edge of uncertainty begin to develop. "Elias," she said, "yes. Came to Texas because I was tired of waiting for my life to begin." She paused. "I would like to stop waiting." He reached across and took her hand, which he had not done before, and she held his hand without pulling away, and they sat for another long while watching the last of the violet fade to black and the first stars appear over the hill country, and Elias Caldwell felt something inside himself that had been sealed shut for 4 long years begin, quietly and irrevocably, to open. They were married in May, at the Kerrville church, in a ceremony that was simple and genuine. Clara wore a dress of ivory cotton that Mrs. Gruber had helped her with, and she carried bluebonnets because they were there and they were beautiful, and she was not a woman interested in pretense. Elias wore his good suit and his best boots, and stood at the front of the church with an expression that the assembled townspeople of Kerrville would later describe, in various ways, as a man who could not quite believe his luck. Tobias stood beside his father as best he could manage, solemn and proud. Samuel stood beside his brother and spent most of the ceremony trying not to fidget, succeeding about half the time. When the Reverend asked Elias if he took Clara as his wife, he said, "I do," in a voice that was firm and clear and carried to every corner of the church without effort. And when he said it, he looked directly at her, not at the reverend, and Clara heard the whole weight of what he meant in those two words and had to blink very carefully to keep her composure. She managed it. She was Clara Denton Caldwell now, and she was not a woman who lost her composure in public. She did, however, allow herself to cry a little that night, privately, after Elias was asleep, not from sadness but from the sheer overwhelming reality of having arrived, at last, at the life she had been reaching toward without knowing exactly what shape it would take. The early weeks of marriage are their own particular education, and Elias and Clara were no exception. They had known each other through letters and careful Saturday visits and Thursday parlor conversations, but living together in the same house, navigating the daily rhythms and habits and small irritations and unexpected delights of a shared life, was a different thing entirely and required its own learning. Elias was an early riser in the extreme, up before first light every morning and out to the barn before Clara had any philosophical interest in being conscious. Clara stayed up reading later than Elias had the stamina for, and the first week she kept the lamp burning in the study until well past 10 o'clock, which he mentioned with such careful politeness that she laughed and told him to just say it plainly. "You are keeping me awake," he said. "Blow out your lamp," she said. "The light under the door does not actually reach you." He considered this. "It is the idea of it," he said. "That is not a reasonable argument." "I know," he admitted. She blew out her lamp at 9:30 from then on, which was a compromise, and he did not mention it again. He was more private about his feelings than she was, which she had known from the letters but experienced differently in person. He showed his feelings through action, through the cup of coffee that was always ready for her when she came down in the morning, through the way he positioned himself between her and any difficulty, before she had even identified the difficulty, through the way he watched her sometimes with an expression she had learned to read as the thing he would say if he were a different kind of man who said things directly. She started telling him what she read in that expression, plainly and without apology, and watching him simultaneously be taken aback and then undeniably grateful for it. "You are thinking," she said one evening when they were sitting on the porch after supper, and he was watching the dark come down over the pasture with that expression in full effect, "that you are happy, and that it surprises you." He looked at her. The surprise moved across his face and then settled into something that was not quite a smile but was close to one. "Yes," he said. "You do not need to be surprised by it," she said. "You are allowed to simply be happy." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I had forgotten what it felt like. Had been afraid to expect it." She reached across the porch to put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of his chair, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that until the stars were fully out and the boys had gone to bed, and the hill country night was singing its particular night song, insects and owls and the distant movement of cattle and the creek below the pasture running clear and cold over its limestone bed. The boys' adjustment was its own story. Samuel's was swift and comprehensive. By June he had transferred the whole of his motherless 9-year-old affection to Clara, with a completeness that was touching and occasionally overwhelming. Appearing at her side at all hours with rocks, he found interesting and questions about everything, and requests for biscuits that she fulfilled with genuine enjoyment, because she had been lonely too before Texas, in ways she had not fully articulated even to herself. Tobias's adjustment was slower and ran deeper and mattered more. He had been the responsible one for 4 years, the boy who kept himself together because his father needed him to. He had grown up faster than any child should have to, and there was a guardedness in him that even Clara's patience had not fully reached. The moment it reached came in late June, during a summer storm. The storms that rolled through the Texas hill country in summer were not genteel affairs. They came up fast and black from the southwest, and this one had arrived while Elias was out in the far north pasture moving cattle to higher ground in Clara, and the boys were at the house. The lightning was severe, and the thunder was the kind that hit the chest physically, and Samuel had abandoned all pretense of bravery and was sitting under the kitchen table with his eyes shut. Clara had found Tobias in the upstairs hallway, standing at the window that looked out west, watching the storm come in with white knuckles on the window frame and an expression she recognized, because she had seen it in the mirror at various points in her own life. The expression of someone holding everything together by pure determination and not sure how much longer they could. She sat down on the floor of the hallway, her back against the wall, and did not say anything. After a moment, Tobias said, without turning from the window, "Mama was afraid of storms." "Was she?" "She never told us," he said. "She always pretended she was not, but I could tell." He paused. "She would make us cocoa and tell us stories so we would not be afraid, and the whole time she was the one who was afraid." Clara said nothing. The thunder rolled through the house. "I miss her," Tobias said, and his voice cracked on it, the way a 12-year-old boy's voice does when he has been holding something in long enough that it finally finds the break. Clara did not stand up and go to him. She understood from long experience with children that sometimes the thing they need is not to be comforted toward, but to be given the space to come to comfort themselves. She stayed on the floor and said simply, "I know you do." He turned from the window and looked at her, sitting on the hallway floor in her summer dress with the stormlight making everything blue and white outside, and something shifted in his face, all that careful 12-year-old dignity giving way to something younger and more honest. He came and sat on the floor beside her, and she put her arm around him, and he leaned his head against her shoulder and cried in that particular way of children who do not normally cry, hard and then done, like a thing that had been necessary and was now finished. When it was over, he sat up straight and wiped his face with his sleeve and did not look at her directly. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome," she said. "Clara," he said, and then stopped. "Yes," he thought for a moment. "I'm glad you are here," he said. Not "I'm glad you married Papa" or "I'm glad you are our mother now," because Tobias was too precise for anything he did not exactly mean. "I'm glad you are here" was what he meant, and it was exactly enough. "I'm glad I'm here too," she said. Downstairs, Samuel was still under the kitchen table. By July, the Caldwell Ranch had settled into a new rhythm, the way a river settles into a new course after a flood, following the contours of what has changed while maintaining the essential character of its flow. Elias and Clara had found their way to each other in the full daily sense, not just the careful and considered sense of the courtship period, but in the ordinary, unglamorous, entirely beautiful sense of two people who have chosen to build something together, and are actually building it. Elias had a hand named Jesse Beaumont who had been with the ranch for 6 years, and who was 23 years old, lanky and cheerful, and absolutely unafraid of hard work. He was the one who ran the daily operations of the bunkhouse crew, 4 other hands who were decent men individually and chaotic as a group, and he had taken an immediate and uncomplicated liking to Clara because she treated him with the same direct respect she treated everyone. There was also the matter of the neighboring ranch to the north, the Hargrove spread, which was run by a man named Dale Hargrove who was argumentative by nature, and had developed the specific grievance that the Caldwell cattle were occasionally crossing into his north pasture through a section of shared fence line that had been in dispute for 2 years before Elias married Clara, and would apparently be in dispute for the foreseeable future. Clara became aware of the dispute through overhearing one of Elias's conversations with Jesse in the yard, and then through the more direct method of Hargrove himself appearing at the ranch gate one August morning while Elias was in town, and making his feelings about the fence line known in considerable volume. She came out onto the porch. Dale Hargrove was a big man in his mid-40s with a red face and the air of a man who had been right about everything for so long that he had forgotten the process of being wrong. He pulled up short when he saw Clara, apparently having expected Elias or Jesse, or at least someone he could argue with on familiar terms. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, somewhat deflated. "Mr. Hargrove," she said pleasantly. "Understand you have concerns about the north fence." He recovered quickly. "Your husband's cattle have been in my north pasture 3 times this summer. That is a legitimate concern," she said, which clearly surprised him because he had been geared for argument. "My husband is in town today, but I would be happy to ride out with you this afternoon and look at the fence section in question myself. Would like to understand the issue directly." Hargrove stared at her. He had clearly not anticipated this response. "You would ride out to look at a fence line," he said flatly. "I am capable of looking at a fence line," she said, "and I'm capable of understanding what I see." There was a pause. "All right then," he said. She rode out with him that afternoon on the chestnut mare Elias had given her when she first arrived, and she looked at the fence line with the same focused attention she brought to everything, and she understood the issue clearly within about 10 minutes. The problem was a section of approximately 40 yards where the posts had rotted at the base, and the wire had gone slack in a way that the Caldwell hands had been patching repeatedly, without addressing the root cause. The cattle were not malicious. They were simply opportunistic, as cattle are. "This needs to come down and be rebuilt," she said to Hargrove. "The posts are rotten through. Patching the wire is not the solution." He looked at her. "Your husband has been patching that wire for 2 years. "Yes," she said evenly. "That will change." She told Elias that evening in full and without embellishment. He listened with his characteristic stillness, and when she was done he said, "You are right about the posts." "I know," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "You could have let me come to it myself." "You might have taken another 2 years," she said. He did not argue this. He sent Jesse and 2 hands out the following week, and they pulled the bad section entirely and rebuilt it with new posts and fresh wire. And the Caldwell cattle stayed in the Caldwell pasture. And Dale Hargrove subsequently sent over a dozen eggs from his wife Martha's chickens, which was the closest thing to an apology his nature was capable of producing, and Clara accepted them graciously and made a pie. The summer of 1879 was a busy and full one. The ranch work was relentless in the way ranch work always is, no matter the season, simply a different variety of relentless, depending on what the calendar demanded. But it was a different kind of work now, shared work. And there is a quality to shared labor that solitary labor can never quite replicate, the sense of a common purpose, of effort that adds up to something larger than any individual contribution. Clara had maintained her teaching through the spring term and was negotiating with the school board about the fall term, a negotiation that was complicated by the school board's ambivalence about whether a married woman should be teaching at all, an ambivalence that Clara addressed with her characteristic directness, and ultimately resolved in her favor by the simple method of being so clearly the best teacher available that the school board's ambivalence became impractical. Elias, who had watched this negotiation from a careful distance because Clara had made clear she wanted to handle it herself, had felt a deep and specific pride in her that had very little to do with the outcome and everything to do with the way she had conducted herself. He told her so, one evening in August when the heat was thick and the windows were open, and they were sitting on the porch drinking lemonade that Samuel had made with enthusiastic inaccuracy, too much sugar and not enough lemon, though nobody told him this. "I am proud of you," Elias said. Clara looked at him with the particular expression she had when something caught her off guard, for negotiating with the school board. "For being exactly who you are in every situation," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Elias Caldwell," she said quietly, "you have gotten considerably better at saying things. You have been an instructive influence," he said. She laughed, and he watched her laugh, and the August evening settled around them warm and sweet as the too sweet lemonade, and the hill country was doing that amber evening thing again, and the boys were somewhere in the yard chasing fireflies that had appeared this week like small gifts from the dark. And Elias Caldwell sat on his porch with his wife and felt the impossible, ordinary completeness of a life that had found its full shape at last. He reached over and took her hand. She let him have it and leaned her head back against the porch post and watched the fireflies too. "I love you," he said. He had not said it before, not in those direct and specific words, though he suspected she had read it in various other forms. He said it now because it was true and because Clara deserved things that were true and said plainly. She turned to look at him. Her face in the amber evening was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he had seen a great deal of beautiful things in the Texas Hill Country, so the competition was not negligible. "I know," she said softly. "I love you too." And then, because she was Clara and she could not resist, she added, "I've been waiting for you to say it." "How long?" "Since approximately April," she said. He shook his head. "You could have said it yourself." "I was waiting for you," she said simply. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture that was old-fashioned and sincere and entirely him, and she looked at him over their joined hands with dark eyes that were soft and steady and entirely hers. September brought a development that Elias handled with characteristic steadiness, and that Clara handled with the particular combination of joy and practical terror that she suspected would be appropriate for the foreseeable future. She told him on a Sunday morning in September, before the boys were awake, in the kitchen over coffee, because Clara did not believe in creating elaborate circumstances for important news when plain circumstances would serve. He had been standing at the kitchen window looking out at the morning the way he did, and she said, "I am going to have a child." He turned from the window. She watched him process it. It moved across his face in stages, surprise, and then something that cracked open into something enormous, and then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and pulled her against him, and held her with his face pressed into her hair and said nothing for a long time because there was nothing language was adequately sized for in that moment. "All right," he said finally into her hair. "All right," she agreed. "You are well?" He asked, pulling back to look at her face with the focused attention of a man taking complete inventory. "Quite well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, otherwise entirely well." He held her face in both his hands and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and between them in that kitchen, with the Sunday morning coming through the window and the coffee going cool on the table, there was a silence that was so full of everything that it weighed almost nothing. The boys received the news that evening at supper, delivered by Clara at Elias's insistence, because he said she should be the one to say it. Samuel put down his fork with considerable solemnity. "There will be a baby," he said. "Yes," Clara said. He thought about this with visible effort. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" "We will not know until it arrives," Elias said. Samuel nodded with the air of a man making a decision. "I would like a brother," he said. "I have thought about it, and that is my preference." "I will pass that along," Clara said gravely. Tobias had said nothing through this exchange. He was looking at his plate with an expression Clara could not quite read. Then he looked up, and his gray eyes, Margaret's eyes, were bright with something careful and genuine. "Will you be all right?" he asked her. "Not will the baby be all right, not will Papa be happy, but will you be all right?" Because Tobias had seen what could happen and he had not forgotten. Clara met his eyes steadily. "I will be all right," she said. "I'm healthy and strong, and your father is not going to let me lift anything heavier than a coffee cup for the next 7 months, which is going to be a significant source of tension between us." Elias said, "That is accurate." Tobias smiled, a full genuine smile, rare and therefore all the more valuable. "Good," he said. The fall term of school began, and Clara taught through October with the particular energy of a person who knows their time in a role is measured, because she had agreed with herself, and with Elias, that she would take leave before the birth and return when the child was old enough. The school board was less enthusiastic about this arrangement than Clara was, but they were also less enthusiastic about the alternative, which was finding another teacher. October in the hill country was mild and golden, the cedar smell stronger in the cooling air, the creek dropping back to its late-year level, the cattle fat from summer grazing. The ranch was settling into the preparation rhythms of autumn, and Elias worked long days that he came home from tired and fed and happy in a way that Jesse Beaumont, who had known him for 6 years, noted privately was qualitatively different from any previous version of his employer's happiness. Jesse had also, somewhere in the course of the summer, developed a considerable regard for the schoolteacher in the nearby town of Kerrville, a young woman named Alice Park who taught the younger grades. Clara knew about this because Alice had mentioned it in a somewhat flustered way during one of their conversations, and Clara had noted it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who finds that good things have a way of propagating. She mentioned it to Elias one evening, not as gossip but as a thing she found genuinely pleasing. "Jesse has his eye on the Park girl," she said. Elias, who had known this since July but had considered it none of his business, said, "He does." "She is fond of him," Clara said. "Is she?" She turned very pink when she mentioned him, Clara said. "That is generally diagnostic." Elias looked at his wife with the expression that meant he was amused and was trying to decide whether to show it. "Should we involve ourselves?" "No," she said. "We should let them work it out. I'm only mentioning it because it pleases me." "Good things please you," he observed. "I see no reason why they should not," she said. She was right, as she was frequently right, and Jesse Beaumont and Alice Park did work it out, in the gradual and uncertain manner of young people who are uncertain whether their feelings are reciprocated. And by December, Jessie had called on Alice with the approval of her father, and the bunkhouse hands, who had been observing Jessie's distraction for months with varying degrees of sympathy and entertainment, declared it a significant development. The winter of 1879 moving into 1880 was mild by hill country standards, which meant it was cold enough but not savage, and the house was warm and full in a way it had not been for years. Clara, visibly expecting by December and entirely unconcerned about it, had rearranged the small bedroom off the kitchen into a nursery that had the characteristic Clara quality of being practical and beautiful simultaneously. Simple furniture, a quilt she had made herself from fabric remnants over the fall, a small window that looked out at the garden where the dormant roses waited for spring. Elias had built the cradle himself, which had taken him 3 weeks of evenings, and had resulted in a piece of furniture that was objectively finer than any he might have ordered from a shop, because Elias Caldwell had grown up building things and had never lost the skill of it. He had set it in the nursery and then stood looking at it for a while with his hands in his pockets and an expression that Clara, who had been watching from the doorway, recognized as the thing he could not say. She came and stood beside him and they looked at the cradle together. "It is beautiful," she said. "I want to get it right," he said, meaning the cradle and also not meaning the cradle. "You already have," she said, meaning the cradle and also not meaning the cradle. He put his arm around her carefully because he had been careful with her in the physical way that she kept insisting was excessive, but that she also found, if she was honest with herself, genuinely sweet. She leaned into him and they stood in the small nursery with the winter afternoon coming pale through the window and the smell of cedar and wood shavings around them. "I'm not afraid," she said, which was mostly true, "but I want you nearby. I will not go further than the house can shout," he said. She smiled. "That is an unusual unit of measurement." "It is a practical one," he said, which was so completely him that she laughed, and the moment shifted from its gravity to something lighter and equally real. The child came in late February of 1880, which was exactly when the doctor had predicted, and which Clara found satisfying because she disliked uncertainty. Elias was, as promised, not further than the house could shout, and Dr. Meadows from Kerrville was present, and the birth was not easy, because births generally are not, but it progressed with the straightforward competence that seemed to characterize Clara's approach to every challenge she encountered. The child was a boy. He was born in the small hours of a Tuesday morning, and Elias was allowed in almost immediately afterward, and he came through the door of the bedroom and saw Clara sitting up in bed with the baby wrapped in the quilt from the nursery, looking exhausted and more luminous than he had words for, and he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. He was small and red and entirely perfect, in the way of newborns, which is to say perfect in a way that is not yet visible to anyone who is not his parent. "Hello," Elias said quietly to his son, and then looked at Clara, and there was everything in that look, the whole enormous 4 years and the loneliness and the letters and the careful courtship and the bluebonnets and the garden and the rainstorm in the hallway and the September morning in the kitchen and all of it, everything, in one look. "Hello," Clara said back, understanding that the hello was also for her. They named him Henry after Elias's father. Henry Caldwell was brought home to the ranch on a Thursday, wrapped in the quilt, and Tobias and Samuel were waiting on the porch with a formality that broke Elias's heart in the best possible way. Samuel looked at the baby for a long time. "He is smaller than I expected," he said finally. "He will grow," Tobias said. "He is definitely a he," Samuel confirmed, lifting the edge of the quilt for verification. "Good, that is what I voted for." "You cannot vote on the sex of a baby," Tobias said. "And yet I was correct," Samuel said serenely. Henry grew as Tobias had predicted. He grew through the spring of 1880 with the single-minded dedication of a young animal in good conditions, which is to say rapidly and in all directions, and the ranch house that had been quiet for 4 years was quiet no longer. Clara returned to teaching in the fall on a reduced schedule that worked around Henry's needs, an arrangement that the school board had initially resisted and then accepted because the alternative remained impractical. The garden came back that spring. Clara had worked it through the fall and winter in small increments, and the rows that had been Margaret's came back with particular vigor, climbing up the new trellis that Elias had built against the garden wall, going further than it had ever gone before. Clara said nothing particular about this, but Elias watched her look at it sometimes with an expression that was quiet and respectful and knowing, and he understood that she was including Margaret in something rather than excluding her, which was exactly the right thing and exactly what he would have expected of her. He told her that one evening. He told her that Margaret would have liked her. Clara was quiet for a moment. "Tell me about her," she said. "Not the grief of losing her, but who she was. Would like to know." So he told her. He told her about Margaret, who had been funny in a way that snuck up on you, who had read voraciously and argued with books she disagreed with, who had been so certain about the rose that could not climb and refused to give up on it, who had been afraid of thunderstorms and hidden it from her children while making them cocoa. Clara listened to all of it with complete attention. "She was remarkable," she said when he was done. "She was," he agreed. "I'm glad your boys had her," she said, "and I'm glad I have your boys." He looked at her. "I'm glad you have all of us," he said, "and that we have you. The years arranged themselves." Jessie Beaumont married Alice Park in the spring of 1880 in a ceremony at the Kerrville church that half the county attended, and Clara cried at the wedding, which she attributed to the fact that she had been at a sentimental point in her cycle, and Elias did not point out that she said this at every wedding she attended. Tobias turned 14 in the fall of 1880 and was, by any measure, becoming a formidable young man. He had the ranch knowledge of someone who had grown up in it and the intellectual life of someone who had been given excellent instruction, and Clara had begun corresponding with a school in San Antonio about the possibility of his attending when he was old enough, which was a conversation she had with Elias first and then with Tobias, because she believed in involving the person most directly affected. Tobias's response to the idea of further schooling was an expression of carefully controlled excitement that Clara recognized as his version of leaping in the air. Samuel turned 12 in 1882 and grew 4 inches in approximately 3 months, becoming suddenly and comprehensively gangly in a way that he found very funny and that Elias found nostalgic. He had lost the gap-toothed grin, grown into his face, and had his father's build and his own particular sunshine quality, the ability to make a room feel warmer simply by being in it. Henry was 2 years old in the spring of 1882 and was conducting his personal exploration of the ranch with the fearlessness of someone who has been loved unconditionally from before he had language for it. He had Clara's auburn hair and Elias's gray eyes and the combined stubbornness of both parents, which was considerable, and he followed his older brothers with a devotion that they returned in full, because Tobias and Samuel had both decided that being an older brother was, in the final accounting, one of the better things they had experienced. Clara was expecting again by the summer of 1882. She told Elias in the kitchen again, over coffee again, on a Sunday morning again, because she said consistency was a virtue and she liked the precedent. He stood at the kitchen window again and turned when she said it, and the response was the same in its essential quality though different in its specifics, because the first time had included a staggering component of surprise and this time was more purely and completely joy without any caveat. "Are you well?" he asked. "Quite well," she said. "Slightly more tired than last time, otherwise well." "I love you," he said, immediately and without any of the April through August delay that had characterized the first time. She smiled. "That was well done," she said. He crossed the kitchen and held her, carefully and then less carefully because she had made her position on excessive caution very clear the first time and he respected her enough to have learned it. And she held him back and over his shoulder the Sunday morning came through the window and the hill country was beginning its summer. "Another Henry," she said into his shoulder. "We do not know it is a boy," he said. "My instinct," she said. "Your instinct was right about the fence posts," he acknowledged. "It was right about you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, against her hair, "What was your instinct about me?" "That you were worth the waiting," she said simply. "And the traveling, and the uncertainty, all of it." He held her closer. "I hope I continue to justify the travel expense," he said, and she laughed, and the sound of it went through the kitchen and out the window and across the yard and into the morning. The second child was born in January of 1883 in the same bedroom, delivered by Dr. Meadows in the same competent manner, and she was a girl. Elias came into the room and Clara had her, wrapped in a new quilt, and this time Clara was less exhausted because she knew the territory better, and she looked at him with those dark eyes that had been the first thing he had properly seen when she stepped off the stage in Kerrville 4 years earlier, and she said, "Come meet your daughter." He came and sat and looked at his daughter and was undone absolutely completely and without reservation. "She has your hair," he said. "She has your nose," Clara said. "That is unfortunate for her," he said. "I like your nose," Clara said. They named her Margaret. Clara had suggested it, simply and without orchestration, saying she had been thinking about it, and that she thought it was the right name if Elias agreed, and she had watched him with the careful attention she always paid when something was important, and he had looked at her for a long time without speaking and then said yes. Tobias heard the name and went very still. "Margaret," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "Your sister Margaret, if that is all right with you." He looked at the baby for a long moment, this small red person with the auburn hair and the name that meant something permanent and loving, and then he looked at Clara with his mother's gray eyes bright in his face. "It is more than all right," he said quietly. Samuel held his opinion in reserve for about 4 minutes, and then announced that Margaret was very small but appeared to have potential, which was, everyone agreed, his highest available category of praise. Henry, who was 3 years old and not entirely certain what was happening, but understood that something significant had occurred, stood on tiptoe to look at his new sister over the edge of the quilt, and then looked at his father with an expression of profound seriousness. "That is mine?" he asked. "That is your sister," Elias confirmed. Henry considered this. "All right," he said, in a tone that indicated he was accepting the arrangement but reserving the right to revisit it. The spring of 1883 came in mild and flowering, and the Caldwell Ranch moved into it with the confident rhythm of something that has found its proper working order. The fence lines were sound. The cattle were healthy. The garden was full of roses that climbed as high as they wished. The schoolhouse in Kerrville had a teacher who had been there long enough that the children could not imagine anyone else. Tobias was 17 and making plans for San Antonio that Clara had helped him draw up, and that Elias had funded without discussion, because there was no discussion needed. It was simply what was going to happen because it was what Tobias deserved. He would go the following year, when he turned 18, to the school that had offered him a place based on the recommendation Clara had secured. And this was a thing of such quiet magnitude that the family circled it gently in conversation, not avoiding it but treating it with the respect due to something large and important. One evening in April, Elias and Tobias sat on the fence rail of the main corral, the same fence rail where two small boys had sat 5 years ago and declared their father needed a wife. The evening was mild and the pasture was green from spring rain and the sky was doing its theatrical thing, going through its colors. "Are you ready?" Elias asked. Tobias thought about it with the seriousness that was his native mode. "I think so," he said. "I am also afraid." "That is about right," Elias said. "Were you afraid when Clara came?" Tobias asked. Elias looked at the evening sky. "Considerably," he said. "You did not show it." "I tried very hard not to," Elias said, which was an echo of something Clara had once said about herself and which Tobias recognized. "She says you were sitting on the fence rail when she first saw you too," Tobias said, "looking like you were trying very hard to appear composed." "I was holding my hat," Elias said. "Like a fool," Tobias smiled. "She does not think so." "No," Elias agreed. "She does not." They sat for a moment in the comfortable silence that had always been natural between them. "Papa," Tobias said. "Yes." "You did a good thing," Tobias said. "I know it was hard and I know you were afraid and I know Sam and I put considerable pressure on you that morning on this fence." He paused. "But you did a good thing." Elias looked at his oldest son, this 17-year-old who was about to become a man in the world in the full sense, and felt the enormous, simple love of it, this ongoing love that is the specific gift of parenthood. "I did not do it alone," Elias said. "You and Sam started it." "We started it," Tobias agreed. "But you did it." They sat until the last of the color was gone and the stars were out and the night insects were singing. Clara was on the porch when they came back, little Margaret asleep in her arms, Henry asleep against her side with his head on her knee, and the lamplight from the window behind her made everything warm and outlined. Elias stopped on the bottom step and looked at her, the way he still did, would always do, with that expression she had learned to read and that still moved her every time. She looked back at him over Margaret's small sleeping head. "Long conversation," she said quietly, not wanting to wake the children. "Important one," he said, equally quiet. He came up the steps and sat beside her and she leaned into him in the comfortable way that had become the natural resting position of both of them, and Margaret slept and Henry slept, and Tobias went inside to read and Samuel's lamp was still on in his window upstairs. "Are you happy?" she asked, as she sometimes did, not from doubt but because she liked hearing him say it. "Deeply," he said, without any of the old hesitation, because 4 years of Clara had cured him of the hesitation with very satisfying completeness. "Good," she said. "Are you?" She considered it seriously, which was her way, giving the question the weight it deserved rather than an easy, immediate answer. "I am," she said. "In every room of my life I am." He pressed his lips to her temple, which was something he did often, and that she received with the particular stillness of a person receiving something that is both ordinary and irreplaceable. The lamplight held them. The hill country night sang around them. The roses in the garden, Margaret's roses and Clara's care and the spring's generosity, were fully open in the dark, climbing their trellis as far as they wished to go. Tobias left for San Antonio the following spring, 1884, on a stage from Kerrville on a blue sky morning with the bluebonnets up along every roadside. The family saw him off. Samuel was 18 by then, grown into himself entirely, working the ranch with his father and Jesse Beaumont with a cheerful competence that made the whole operation run more smoothly. Henry was 4 and extremely clear that he did not understand why Tobias was getting on the stage and what the stage was for, and small Margaret was 1 year old and entirely uninterested in the logistics but very interested in the horses. Tobias embraced Clara last. He held her with the full sincerity of someone who knows the value of what they are holding because they have had reason to know its absence. "Take care of yourself," she said into his shoulder. "I will write," he said. "You will write regularly," she said, pulling back to look at him with her schoolteacher expression. "I expect a letter every 2 weeks." "Every 2 weeks," he agreed, and smiled his rare full smile, and the stage pulled out and the Caldwell family stood on the Kerrville sidewalk watching it go until it turned and was gone. Elias put his arm around Clara. She leaned into him. "He will be magnificent," she said. "He already is," Elias said. He was not wrong. The letters came every 2 weeks without fail, sometimes exceeding that frequency, and they were articulate and thoughtful and occasionally very funny, and Clara read them aloud at the supper table, and the family received Tobias's ongoing adventures in San Antonio like installments of a story they were invested in, because they were. Samuel did not go to school in any formal sense after the ranch took him fully, but Clara's teaching continued informally, through conversation and argument and the particular education of reading everything available, and he was, in his way, as well-formed intellectually as his brother, just in different directions. He also, at 20, began calling on the daughter of a cattle rancher to the east, a girl named Rose Archer who had dark eyes and a laugh that you could hear from 3 properties away. Clara liked her immediately, and Elias liked her after a few visits, and Elias said to Clara one evening, "He has good taste." "He does," she agreed. "He has always had good judgment about people." "He gets that from you," Elias said. "He gets it from watching his father," she said. This was the kind of disagreement they had, the kind that ended in both people thinking better of themselves, which Clara privately considered the best kind. The summer of 1885 arrived with a dry heat that made the hill country bake down to its limestone bones and turn every shade of gold and brown, and the particular blue-gray of cedar under pressure. The water situation was a concern, as it always was in dry years, and Elias and Jesse worked the stock tank and creek management with the focus of men who knew that water was not something to be casual about in Texas. But the cattle came through it well because the ranch was in good order, the range properly managed, the supplemental feed on hand from careful foresight in the spring. Elias had been ranching long enough to know that preparedness in the good years was what got you through the hard ones, and the Caldwell ranch ran with the prepared competence of something well-tended. Henry was 5 and had developed an opinion about everything, which he shared freely and at length, to the considerable entertainment of everyone around him and the occasional exhaustion of his parents. He had the auburn hair and the dark eyes and the absolute determination of both his parents combined into one very small person, and the ranch hands had already unanimously concluded that he was going to be formidable. Margaret was too and entirely her own phenomenon, quiet where Henry was loud, watchful where he was immediately engaged, with a quality of patient attention that reminded Clara, with a warmth she could not describe, of the way Tobias had stood at the rainstorm window. She told Elias this one evening. "Margaret watches things the way Tobias watches things," she said. "Before she does anything, she looks at it for a very long time." Elias looked at his daughter where she sat in the yard examining a small rock with total concentration. "Yes," he said. "She is going to be the one who understands things without being told," Clara said. He looked at her. "Where have I heard that before?" Clara smiled. "It is apparently a quality I respond to." He laughed, and she loved his laugh still, the way it was so entirely genuine every time, as though he had never quite gotten used to finding things funny and was freshly grateful each time it happened. He put his arm around her and they watched their daughter examine her rock with the absolute focus of someone for whom a rock is currently the most important thing in existence. "Clara," he said. "Yes. Think about that morning sometimes," he said. "The boys on the fence. How I nearly choked on my coffee. And what do you think about it? Think about how close I came to saying no," he said. "To saying I would think about it indefinitely and never quite doing anything, the way I had been doing for 4 years. You would have gotten there eventually," she said. "I'm not sure," he said honestly. "You might have had to come and find me yourself." She considered this. "I would have," she said. "Eventually." He looked at her. "Would you have?" "I was tired of waiting for my life to begin," she said, which was what she had written to Mrs. Whitmore's correspondence service and what she had meant entirely and still meant. "I would not have waited forever." He held her a little closer. "I am grateful every day," he said, "that my sons had better courage than I did." "They did not have better courage," she said. "They had less to lose. Courage is a different thing when you have already lost something." He was quiet. "How do you do that?" he asked. "What?" "Understand things that I have never said." She looked up at him with those dark eyes that had taken in the Texas sky that first day and found it extraordinary and never stopped finding it so. "I have been paying attention," she said. "For 6 years, have been paying attention to you. I know you, Elias. I know every room of you." "And," he said, and there was something in the asking that was still faintly uncertain, the old caution that never entirely went away but had learned to be humble rather than closed. "And," she said, "I would not trade a single room for anything in the world." He kissed her then, in the yard, with Henry running circles somewhere behind them, and Margaret examining her rock, and the hill country spread out in every direction in its dry, golden summer magnificence. And the kiss was the particular kind that belongs to people who have known each other long enough to know exactly what they are saying when they say nothing at all. By the fall of 1886, Tobias was home. He had completed his studies in San Antonio and arrived back on the stage with 2 years of education, 3 new books, and a young woman named Evelyn Cole, who was the daughter of his professor, and who was 22 years old and possessed of the same intellectual seriousness as Tobias, which meant they could disagree productively about almost any topic for hours without any loss of warmth between them. Clara liked her within the first 15 minutes. The family dinner that welcoming evening was the fullest the Caldwell table had ever been. Tobias and Evelyn, Samuel and Rose, who were engaged by then, to the considerable approval of everyone involved. Jessie Beaumont and Alice from their own place to the south. Elias and Clara. Henry, 6 years old and extremely vocal about everything. Margaret, 3 years old and eating with the focused gravity of someone taking a meal very seriously. Clara sat at the table and looked at all of it and felt something that was so complete it had no particular name. The lamp was lit. The food was on the table. Outside, the fall was settling over the hill country in its gentle amber way, the cedar smell strong in the evening air. Margaret's roses were finishing their late-season flowering, climbing their trellis further than they ever had before. Elias caught her eye from across the table, over Henry's animated account of something that had happened to a frog near the stock tank that apparently constituted a major event. He looked at her with that expression she had first seen holding his hat outside the stage station 7 years ago, the one that meant everything he could not easily say, which was now also the one that included everything they had built and were building and would continue to build, because that is the nature of things built well. They do not finish, they continue. She looked back at him with everything she had, which was considerable, because Clara Caldwell had never been a person who did anything by halves. Henry paused in his frog narrative. "Are you two looking at each other again?" he asked with the blunt directness of 6 years. "Yes," Elias said. "Why?" Henry asked. "Because," Clara said, "your father is someone I very much like looking at." "That is not a real answer," Henry said. "It is the real answer," Clara said. Henry considered this with the expression of a person who suspects there is something happening that he does not yet have the context to understand, and filed it under things to revisit later. Tobias and Evelyn were married in the spring of 1887 in Kerrville, as Elias and Clara had been married in Kerrville, in the same church with the same reverend, though the reverend's hair had gone considerably more white since 1879. It was a full ceremony with the full county, and Clara cried at it and was not remotely embarrassed about it, because she had given up pretending she did not cry at weddings and found the honesty much more comfortable. Samuel and Rose were married that same fall, a quieter affair at the Archer Ranch, which suited Samuel's practical nature entirely. Rose wore wildflowers in her hair and laughed through most of the ceremony in the best possible way, and Samuel looked at her with an expression that was entirely his own version of his father's expression, the one that meant everything. Clara and Elias danced at both weddings. Elias was not, by his own admission, a gifted dancer, but he was a willing one, which Clara had always found worth considerably more than gift without willingness. He held her correctly and moved with sufficient rhythm, and she did not care about anything beyond the specific quality of being held by him, which had not diminished in the years since it first became available to her, and showed no signs of beginning to. By the summer of 1888, the Caldwell Ranch was a different thing from what it had been in the winter of 1878. Not different in its character, in its essential quality of being a place that worked the land honestly and well, but different in its fullness. Tobias and Evelyn lived on the eastern portion that Elias had deeded to his son when he married, in a house they had built themselves with help from Jesse and the ranch hands. Samuel and Rose lived to the south. The original ranch house, where Elias and Clara and Henry and Margaret lived, was the center of a collection of lives that radiated outward from it in every direction. Henry was 8 years old and had opinions about cattle management that were sometimes incorrect and always firmly held, and Elias had begun giving him real work, because he had determined that the best way to teach a strongly opinionated 8-year-old about cattle management was to let him make small reversible mistakes under supervision. Clara had opinions about this educational method that she expressed with characteristic directness, and that Elias received with the equanimity of a man who knows his wife is at least half right. Margaret was 5 and had begun to read, which she pursued with an intensity that Clara recognized as a reflection of her own early self, and which she encouraged with the full resources of her teaching experience. Margaret reading at the kitchen table while the household moved around her was a sight that Elias came upon one evening and stood in the doorway watching for a long time, this small red-haired person with the gray eyes, entirely absorbed, entirely herself. He went and told Clara, who was in the garden. "She is reading the Dickens," he said. Clara looked up from the roses. "She told me she was going to," she said. "Told her it was quite challenging for 5. "Is she managing it?" "She has not asked for help," Clara said, "though I suspect she has been reading the difficult words aloud very quietly to herself." "Your daughter," Elias said. "Our daughter," she corrected, and he smiled at the correction because it was exactly right. The fall of 1888 settled over the hill country and the Caldwell Ranch and the lives that had taken root in and around it with the particular quality of an autumn that feels like the right season at the right time. The work was in order. The cattle were well. The fence lines held. The garden, which was now considerably more ambitious than the dormant mess Clara had found when she first arrived, was putting itself to bed for winter with the confidence of something that expected to return. Elias and Clara sat on the porch on an October evening, 10 years after the correspondence service and the cautious letters and the Thursday parlor visits. Henry was inside, arguing with himself about something. Margaret was reading in the lamplight behind them, visible through the window, and the hill country night was all around them, huge and starred and cedar-scented. 10 years, Clara said. Almost exactly, Elias said. Do you remember the coffee? She asked. He looked at her. The coffee? When the boys were on the fence rail, you nearly choked on your coffee. He laughed, quiet and genuine. I remember. Think about that morning sometimes, she said. I was not there, obviously, but Tobias told me about it years ago, how Samuel said you lost when the vote came in. He did, Elias confirmed. With considerable satisfaction. He had good judgment, Clara said. He was 9 years old and he had better judgment than most adults. He gets that from you, Elias said. She looked at him. You say that every time. Because every time I mean it. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. It was a motion so habitual and natural that neither of them thought about it anymore, which was its own kind of testimony to what 10 years of careful, genuine choosing will do. Elias, she said. Yes. If I had not come on that stage, she said, if the correspondence service had sent someone else, or if you had decided not to write at all. Do not, he said. Am not finishing the thought the way you think, she said. Am only thinking about how many small things had to happen in exactly the right way, and how am grateful for every one of them. He held her a little tighter. Across the yard the cedar trees were dark shapes against the lesser dark of the star-thick sky. Somewhere a coyote called, distant and clear, the sound of the hill country at night being completely and entirely itself. I used to think, Elias said slowly, that I was managing, that the ranch was running and the boys were all right and I was managing. And then you came and understood what I had been missing. He paused. It is not that you fixed something broken. It is that you completed something that was incomplete. Clara lifted her head and looked at him, and in the porch lamplight her face was entirely known to him and entirely new, the way it always was, the way it had been since February of 1879 on the Kerrville sidewalk. That is the most beautiful thing you have ever said to me, she said. Have been practicing, he said, which was a small echo of an old joke between them, and she smiled at it with the warmth of something that has been kept well. Elias Caldwell, she said. Clara Caldwell. You are someone I very much like looking at, she said, returning Henry's question from the dinner table 2 years ago, the real answer she had given then and gave again now. He looked at her. The night was all around them, the hill country night, the most beautiful sky in the world, the enormous, ordinary, miraculous, specific sky that she had never gotten used to finding extraordinary, just as she had said she would not on that afternoon in the high pasture when they were still learning each other, when the learning was still mostly ahead of them. The roses climbed their trellis in the dark. The children breathed in the house. The ranch stretched out across the limestone hills to every horizon. I love you, he said, with no hesitation at all. I love you, she said back with everything she had. The hill country night held them, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the lives of the people they had made between them and around them continued in their particular directions. Tobias and his books and Evelyn, Samuel and his sunshine and Rose, Henry and his opinions and the cattle he would one day understand better than anyone, Margaret and her Dickens and the patient watching attention that would serve her well all her life, Jessie and Alice in their own house to the south, and the garden, Margaret's roses and Clara's care, and the climbing determination of things that grow toward light. All of it rooted in a morning in 1878 when two small boys sat on a fence rail and said, with the wisdom that is sometimes granted to children who have suffered a loss and grown honest because of it, that their father needed a wife. They had been right. He had needed her. And she had needed them, this ranch and this man and these boys and this enormous sky, this life that had been waiting for her in Texas while she was in Virginia, tired of waiting for her life to begin. It had begun. It was, every day, still beginning.